Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Composer's Footprints, our new series where we figure out how to identify composers just by listening to miscellaneous googies that may have, hopefully, indications that tell us exactly who the person was who did the creative work. Now, the one thing I need to emphasize, I decided to go with the name Composer's Footprints, and I thank all of you for your suggestions of names for this series. But I like Footprints. I agree with the person who suggested that it has a sense of detective work, which is what we're going to be doing at least a little bit of. And, the one thing we need to keep in mind, however, is that great composers are distinctive in just about everything they do. So they have way more than two footprints. They're more like centipedes. They can have dozens of footprints. We're going to usually limit ourselves to two or three or four, something like that, depending on the composer. And we're beginning with Sibelius. And the reason I wanted to start with Sibelius is because he is one of the most characterful composers that ever lived. Everything he did in his own way. And he was also primarily a composer of orchestral music. So we can take wonderful samples from his orchestral works and sort of pin him down rather quickly and easily. So we'll see how this goes. So Sibelius had, like I said, an enormously personal style. People tend to forget about that. He's judged in a way which is like, well, even when I was in Helsinki, let me put it to you that way, and I met with members of the Sibelius Academy who are quite the grim bunch, let me tell you, and terribly serious. And we had a lunch that was set up somehow by the Ministry of Culture, and I know that they were sitting there wondering, what the hell are we doing with this jerk from the United States who wrote a book on Sibelius and who doesn't know anything about Finland or Finnish things? It was kind of a little scary. Although there were, Eric Tavastierna Jr., the second one, the son of the great Eric Tavastierna, the Sibelius biographer, he was very nice. He really was. But the other couple of them were kind of, well, dour, shall we say. But anyway, when I asked them about, who is Sibelius, who does he most resemble and what does he like, was he like, and things like that, they all said Brahms. And I was like, Brahms? Are you kidding? There's anybody who sounds less like Brahms than Sibelius. Well, that's part of the issue. It really is. Because, yes, there is a certain organic quality to his symphonic music, which you can compare to the somewhat organic quality that we hear in Brahms. But it just goes to show, Sibelius's principal market was Germany, and his publisher was German, and all of the sort of direction that his fans and supporters and scholars sort of direct is German, and he's not. He's just not. Maybe he wishes he was. Anyway, that has nothing to do with the sound of his music, which is completely distinctive and totally not Brahmsy. Brahms, like most German symphonic composers, was essentially a contrapuntist. That was the German symphonic style. It was based on a handling of counterpoint, a relationship between harmony and melody that Sibelius is entirely divorced from. He really is. Even though he studied in Vienna, all of that stuff, it just isn't his thing. So what is his thing? Well, we're going to talk not about construction and formal issues, but rather, like I said, sound, the sheer sound of his music. And I have three categories that we're going to deal with, all with musical examples. They have to deal with the sections of the orchestra, the strings, the brass, and, well, then a harmonic thing. The woodwinds, well, we could deal with that separately too, but we're not going to in this particular talk. We'll mention it as it comes up. Anyway, let's start with the strings. wonderful handling of the strings. One of his most characteristic sounds in handling stringed instruments is what they call cross-hatched string writing. I mean, in other words, it just goes chugga 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 chugga. If you look at it on the page, it looks sort of like it's well, cross-hatched. I mean, that's the word for it. But Sibelius, like most violinist composers, understood that if you wanted to be a great orchestral composer, you couldn't pay attention to the violins. It's actually rather fascinating how he very seldom gives the violins, big, huge melodies without immediately cutting them off and giving them to the brass or starting them with the woodwinds. Or if he's using strings, he prefers the darker sonorities of the cellos, the lower members of the string section. It's kind of amazing because he was, almost a concert violinist by training, but his writing for the strings drives string players crazy because it mostly consists of tremolos, and this crosshatch string writing is a variant of the tremolo. This chugga chugga chugga. It's wonderful. It does wonderful things. It creates movement, which is always a big deal if you're a symphonist, particularly. And here is a typical example of the way that string accompaniment creates movement. It's wonderful because Sibelius juxtaposes this rapid underlying movement motive, this chugga 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 thing, with slower melodies on top. And this floats those melodies. It gives them incredible energy. So let's listen to the opening, a piece of the opening from the opening section of On Saga, one of his earliest tone poems. And you hear that right from the beginning, he was doing this sort of crosshatch string writing thing. Here's a sample. It's with the Iceland Symphony Orchestra under Petri Sakari. Very good performances, by the way. And here it is. Did you catch it underneath there? If you didn't, well, one of the things that he could also do with this wonderful cross-hatched string writing, this sort of constant chugga 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 thing, is he could make it thematic. In other words, sometimes he buries melodies within all the chugga chugging, and you can hear the tunes come out as they're doing their thing. Here's a wonderful moment from the finale of the Fourth Symphony, where you really, really hear this. Listen carefully. It's very soft, but it's wonderful. There's just this buzz of activity with melodies buried within, and then the woodwinds doing some characteristic stuff on top of it later on. Here it is. That's the soft version of it. The opening of his tone poem, Luanotar, is almost entirely just that kind of string writing. And it's marvelous. Nobody sounds like it. The fascinating thing about these devices that Sibelius uses is that they're incredibly simple. Almost primal elements of musical expression with the various instruments that are doing it. But no one had done it before. At least to the same extent. as to make it a function of one's personal style. Here's the last example. It's from Pohjola's Daughter, the tone poem. And in the recapitulation, the big moment where Wainamoinen is just cut off his second leg or whatever he's done. He's whacked his foot and he's very upset and he's getting on his sleigh and he's heading off or something's happening. It's just an incredibly vibrant and motive kind of thing. It could be the Maiden of the North spinning wheel that we're hearing. Who knows? But the strings are just hauling. It's really, really extraordinary and powerful. But I'm sure you can hear these are all similar ideas. I actually held up the tone poem thing for the Fourth Symphony. I should have held up the symphony box. We'll do the symphony box for everything else. But yeah, so there you go. That kind of string writing is entirely typical of Sibelius. And really, when you hear it, I can't think of many other composers who do the same thing. There's a moment in the finale of Dvorak's Sixth Symphony when it's just before the big tune comes in loudly, when it's going da 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 da, the strings start doing a Sibelius thing. Chugga 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 da 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 dum ba da 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 da. You hear something similar. And one of the cool things actually about these footprints is that once you have them in your head, once you've heard them and you identify them for what they are, you'll recognize them when you hear them in other composers who don't use them as frequently, but who may use them nonetheless, because these are, fundamental things you do with instruments by and large. And so it doesn't mean anyone's borrowing from anybody. Don't get that into your head. But textures and sounds recur frequently in our musical tradition. And it actually, making these connections is a very satisfying thing when listening. So, they have potential well beyond the world of Sibelius. So after the strings, as I said, Sibelius has a very characteristic way of treating woodwind sections. Usually they burble along in thirds, pairs of them, and the interval of a third. You hear it at the opening of the Fifth Symphony or in the central episode in the Third Symphony, but I don't have examples of that because you'll, catch it when you hear it. And just like that, they just roll along. It's like a babbling brook. It's delightful. But I want to talk about the brass, because Sibelius's handling of the brass is extraordinarily personal. And one of the mainstays of his musical language, he treats the brass generally as a section with huge, long, swelling chords underpinned by the timpani, often with a sforzando at the beginning. So it's bum, like that. And oh gosh, there's so many examples of it. It's hard to tell where to start, but we will start. What are we going to do? Oh, okay. Well, back to the symphonic poems for a minute. Tapiola. One of the main motives in Tapiola, you only hear it twice actually, but it's totally characteristic, does exactly what I just said. It's very, very short and easy to hear. So here it is. Right? I mean, isn't that clear? That's the idea in a nutshell. And Sibelius uses that concept constantly, especially at various climaxes. For example, we were listening to Pohjola's Daughter a minute ago for his string writing, and the climax of that passage with all the strings going chugga 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 like that, is this huge brass thing doing exactly what we just heard in Tapiola. So here is that climax from Pohjola's Daughter. And, you know, it's really amazing how you can tell just from that little thing that you're dealing with Sibelius, especially with the timpani rolls underneath. It can't be anybody else. It's amazing. Here's another example of that from the first movement of the Fourth Symphony, where the orchestra is almost divided up completely into separate sections. They hardly ever mingle. You've got the strings doing most of the opening stuff, and then the brass come in, together, and it's just unbelievably powerful. But also, like I said, incredibly simple the way Sibelius does it. It's a true understanding of what instruments can do and the value of their sound. Here it is. That was, again, the Iceland Symphony under Petri Sakari on Naxos, which lets me use sound samples. Yay! So we can do these. So that's that. And then the third footprint, because Sibelius has at least 3 feet. Actually, we've talked about 4 feet so far. He has lots of feet. He's got feet coming out of him, every part of his body, basically. This is his distinctive endings. Sibelius likes to end things quite often with an amen kind of cadence. Amen. It's not always the liturgical plagal cadence or whatever they call it that does the amen, but an amen-like thing. It can be strictly like in church, or it could be one that that he invents himself, but it's part of the same family of endings. And there's just gazillions of these suckers. I mean, here's the ending of the Second Symphony. Oh, how satisfying that is, isn't it? It's marvelous. It's just, it's so fulfilling. It's a chorale kind of thing, and it does have a quasi-religious character. It really does. As, for example, also, particularly, the ending of the first movement of the Third Symphony, where the whole thing comes to a dead halt totally a dead halt. And then there's some timid woodwind things going da da. The strings answer with da da. And all of a sudden, kaboom! The amen ending. Yeah, and perhaps the most lovely of all of them. And you hear these like throughout his entire career. They're real hallmarks of his style. Is the very ending of the Seventh Symphony, which is a set of interlinking sort of amens between the brass and strings. They overlap each other, and it's just a feeling of total fulfillment. Really an extraordinary thing. And again, achieved by just the simplest of means. It's so beautiful and so affecting. Here's the very end of the Seventh Symphony. Sibelius's amen endings are actually, one of the most distinctive elements of his style and his most effective endings. Because Sibelius had an issue with endings. He really did. He could set up so much momentum in his pieces that he wasn't really sure how to stop it. That happens, for example, the first movement of the Sixth Symphony, where it makes several efforts to try and stop, or the very ending of the Fifth Symphony with those long spaced chords that he had such a hard time trying to work out exactly how to do it. He had other ways of ending things, but the amen always did it. And of course, like most great composers, he was interested in variety and being original and all of those things, and so he couldn't use it for everything. I mean, it didn't work for every single ending, but a lot of composers have distinctive endings, and we'll be talking about them as we go on in this series. It really is quite wonderful. There's one other thing I did want to mention, though, before we sign off, regarding those wonderful brass chords that you hear all over the place. I mean, other places besides the ones I mentioned, for example, the second movement of the Second Symphony. Well, you just hear them everywhere. But it's part of a larger process in Sibelius, which is his melodic style more generally. I'm not playing more examples, but the idea of swelling out with a big, long note and then with sort of a quick little finish is something that you hear in everything that he wrote. Think of the very opening of the Violin Concerto. I mean, that's a perfect example. Ya da da, ya ba da da da, like that. I mean, that's the first theme of the first movement of the First Symphony. Ya ya da 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 da. Or in the Second Symphony, ba ya da 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 dum bum. You hear them over and over and over again. When he transfers that melodic style and turns it into a distinctive brass motive, then you have a really unique fingerprint. But one of the things that makes it so marvelous is that his use of that kind of technique, that swelling out on a long note and then a sort of flurry of notes at the end, is a distinctive quality of his melodic writing more generally. And so these are not like these footprints don't stomp as footprints tend to on the music in the sense that he's just going along and all of a sudden footprint, there it is, or you don't hear it that way at all. You hear a coherent musical language, and when the different instrumental voices pick up on elements of that language, they do things that are very characteristic. But it's all part of a single idiom. I mean, that's what an idiom is, isn't it? It's his method of musical speech. And so all of the elements that we've discussed here are integrated into that method of musical speech. Sometimes you hear them in isolation, and sometimes you hear them in combination with other elements of his musical speech. And it's the combinations that get to be really interesting as you digest these various ideas. And here Sibelius used them consistently. So there you have it, my friends, our very first discussion of composers' footprints. We've heard all 3 or 4 or 5 of Sibelius's feet. I hope you enjoyed this. I look forward to doing more of these talks. If you enjoy them too, let me know, and we'll take it from there. Keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.